First of all, does anybody know where the Bozeman Trail goes through? Through that Bozeman area. It's a long trail through the southern part of Montana to where? Oregon. Very good. Now again, as part of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, the federal government had permission to build forts along the Bozeman Trail. And the Bozeman Trail was a route from Fort Laramie in the Wyoming Territory to Virginia City in the Montana Territory. Okay? It was a trail from Fort Laramie in the Wyoming Territory up through to Virginia City in the Montana Territory. Okay? So the Bozeman Trail was a route from Fort Laramie in the Wyoming Territory to Virginia City in the Montana Territory. Okay, as we mentioned, they set up an agreement to build forts. And after the Civil War, the Sioux Indians began to resist the movement of white settlers again. And where were these settlers going to? You know, where they weren't going to Oregon. Anybody know why they're going to Virginia City and Nevada City and Bannock, all in the Montana Territory? To do what? Mine and pan gold. So there was a lot of settlers moving along the Bozeman Trail to the gold fields of Montana, which were in Virginia City, Montana, Nevada City, Montana, and Bannock. Both Virginia City and Nevada City are close to kind of like Ennis, Montana, and Bannock's over by Dillon, Montana, more in the west. But there were 3 gold fields that people were traveling. And so forts were established. Now the U.S. Army General that was given orders to establish 3 forts along the Bozeman Trail was U.S. Army General John Pope. So U.S. Army General John Pope, who's on your sheet, was the man responsible to build 3 forts along the Bozeman Trail to provide protection for settlers that were heading to the gold fields of Montana. So again, General John Pope was given orders from Washington to build 3 forts, or supervising the building of 3 forts along the Bozeman Trail to provide protection to those white settlers traveling the route to the gold fields of Montana. The first fort was called Fort Reno. Fort Reno. And Fort Reno. Now this was located by the banks of the Powder River in Montana. Does anybody know where the Powder River is in Montana? It's in eastern Montana by Glendive, in that area, between Terry and Glendive. So Fort Reno was located on the banks of the Powder River in Montana, and it was under the command of General Patrick E. Connor. Patrick E. Connor. So the first fort built along the Bozeman Trail to help curb Indian issues was Fort Reno, located on the banks of the Powder River in Montana and eastern Montana, and was under the command of General Patrick E. Connor. The second fort was called Fort C.F. Smith. Fort C.F. Smith. Better known as just Fort Smith. It's located in southeastern Montana near the Bighorn River. Okay, southeastern Montana near the Bighorn River, in this area here. Fort Smith. Located near the Bighorn River in southeastern Montana. It was under the command of Captain N.C. Kinney. Captain N.C. Kinney. And the one we'll talk about in detail was Fort Phil Kearny. Anybody that name ring a bell in your Civil War notes? Fort Phil Kearny. Yes, Caleb.
Well, no, it's the
Yeah, Fort Phil Kearny. He was a general in the Civil War. Now, this is located near Story, Wyoming. You guys know where Story, Wyoming is?
Yep.
Over by where? Sheridan, in the Sheridan area. Okay? So Fort Phil Kearny was located in Story, near Story, Wyoming. You ever heard of the Big and Little Piney Creeks? That's where it's located. So Fort Phil Kearny was the third fort. It was located along the Big and Little Piney Creeks near Story, Wyoming, which is close to Sheridan.
I have a question.
Yeah,
How big is that town?
it's tiny. Story?
Yeah, like
I
100?
mean, I mean, just nothing there. I mean, not even intensely.
Kirby's.
Yeah, about like Kirby. That's about perfect. Okay?
We have a town,
Now,
like middle of Wyoming, that has 0 population.
the man that commanded Fort Phil Kearny was Colonel Henry B. Kerrigan, and we'll talk about him a ton. So this newly established fort, Fort Phil Kearny, near Story, Wyoming, was under the command of Colonel Henry B. Carrington. Henry B. Carrington. Now, although Fort Reno was important, and although Fort Smith was important, the most visible of these 3 forts, the one that had the most action, which we'll talk about, was Fort Phil Kearny. That's where we'll concentrate our studies. And which takes us to our next subtopic, which is what, Mauricio? On the other page, the other side. Fort Phil Kearny. Okay? Important things you know about this, Fort Phil Kearny. We're going to go to it in our field trip in May.
Nice.
Yeah.
You'll like it. Okay. As I mentioned, Fort Phil Kearny was under the command of Colonel Henry B. Harrington and the U.S. Army's 18th Regiment. Okay, so Fort Phil Kearny was under the command of Colonel Henry B. Carrington and the U.S. Army 8th Regiment.
8th or 18th?
Excuse me, 18th. Fort Phil Kearny was under the command of Colonel Henry B. Carrington and was inhabited by the U.S. Army 18th Regiment. Now, the man that chose the site for the fort wasn't John Pope. He was responsible for building forts, but Carrington himself chose the spot. And guess who helped him? You ever heard of Jim Bridger?
Yeah.
Historic scout Jim Bridger actually helped Carrington pick the spot for Fort Phil Kearny. So Carrington was responsible to choose the site for the fort, and he enlisted the help of historic Western scout Jim Bridger. Now, Bridger wouldn't endorse this spot. He didn't like it. But Carrington stayed with it for 2 reasons. Anybody want to guess what those 2 reasons were that he stayed with that spot even though Bridger didn't like it? Oh, yep.
Is it like up on a hill? Is there like good visibility?
No, it wasn't anything practical.
Ooh,
Yep, go ahead.
it was in the middle between the other 2 points.
That's almost too practical. Yep,
It looked nice.
sort of. Not, well, kind of looked nice to someone. Who?
It's white.
Very good. One of the reasons was because Carrington's wife liked the spot. And the other reason he didn't take Bridger's advice is because he was simply tired of traveling. So he just said, I've traveled enough, this is a great spot, my wife likes it, we're going to stay with it. So Bridger did not endorse the spot selected by Carrington, but Carrington stayed with the original spot because his wife liked the area and he was tired of traveling. Now, Carrington had a little bit of wimp to him. His officers that served under him at Fort Phil Kearny kind of saw him as soft. And he never would engage hostile Indians if they were in the area. There were quite a few, because the Tongue River was nearby too. And Carrington's officers saw him as soft, someone that really wasn't on the offensive. It's kind of really conservative. They didn't really like that. And the reason that Carrington hesitated on attacking nearby Indians because he believed he was short of men to defeat the Indians, and he actually was correct. So he wasn't as dumb as his officers might think he was. So he was very conservative, Carrington's officers under his command deemed him as soft, thought he was a little bit reluctant, thought he should be a little more aggressive towards the Indians that lived in the area to drive him out. Carrington didn't think he should do that, didn't think he should go out on the offensive and attack, because he didn't believe he could win battles with the Native Americans in the area because he didn't have enough men. And his instincts would prove to be true. Well, the construction of the fort started in late June 1866. Late June 1866 is when they started to build Fort Phil Kearny. Late June 1866. That's when the construction began. Now, the population in Fort Phil Kearny during the building consisted of 450 soldiers and several civilians, 600 people total. So there were 150 civilians and 450 soldiers of the U.S. Army 18th Regiment there, building this fort. Okay? So there were about 600 people was the population of Fort Phil Kearny. 450 of those people were soldiers, 150 were civilians. Now, what do you think the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho Indians thought of the building of this fort? They didn't like it because it threatened their way of life. Okay, so they're going to resist. Now, this was a very forested area, so the fort was built of logs from surrounding forests. Okay, it was built from logs, so they just built it from scratch right there. They used the surrounding forest land to do so. Here was a soldier's daily job during this time. Each soldier had a daily job of digging a trench 3 feet deep by 3 feet wide by 9 feet long. If you were a soldier, you were to dig a trench 3 feet wide, 9 feet long, and 3 feet deep each day. Okay, a trench. And what are they basically building here? The outside of the fort. And what are they going to put in those trenches? Logs upside, or not straight up and down so they can build the fort, and they're going to bury it there. Okay, so each soldier had a daily job of digging a trench 3 feet deep by 3 feet wide by 9 feet long when the fort was being constructed. And then wagon trains went daily for wood in the nearby hillsides. And what happened when they went out to get that wood? Indians would assault them. They would attack them. So wagon trains went daily for wood in the nearby hillsides, usually under assault by hostile warriors every day. So soldiers had to not only go get the trees, but they had to protect the wagon trains as well. So these trains were constantly being provided support from the soldiers to safety to gather the needed logs and bring them back to the fort. Oh, can you imagine building a fort under these circumstances? But that's what they did. And finally, in October of 1866, the fort was completed. Okay, October of 1866, the fort was completed. October of 1866.
Only 4 months.
Yep, pretty good. Now, here are 5 features that this fort had, which were kind of unusual, kind of up to date for a fort in those days. Okay? 5 features. Now, how big was that fort? It covered 17 acres. 17 acres. So that's one feature, is the fort covered 17 acres. The walls, and you might think, you might kind of shake your head a little bit this time. Guess how high the walls were?
5 foot.
8 foot high. Now you'd think they'd probably be a lot higher than that, but they weren't. They were 8 feet high. They estimated that over 4,000 logs were used in this construction. 4,000, that's the third feature. So it covered 17 acres, it had an 8-foot wall, and they estimated over 4,000 logs were used in its construction. Had a 100-foot flagpole right in the middle. What's that?
I'm just wondering, why did they just set the fort on fire?
What?
When did they just set the fort on fire?
Well, that'll happen later.
No, I mean while they're there.
No, they just didn't. And I'll kind of explain the Indian philosophy of that. Okay, a 100-foot flagpole in the middle of the grounds. And also, the fifth thing is it had 2 steam-powered sawmills. And what did they use that for?
Cutting the wood.
Into what?
Ireland.
Well, not necessarily. Boards to build things, furniture, etc. So it had 2 steam-powered sawmills that cut lumber into boards and made furniture. So when the fort was completed, it included the following features. 1, it covered 17 acres. 2, it had a wall 8 foot high. 3, it consisted of approximately 4,000 logs. 4, it had a 100-foot flagpole in the middle. And 5, it had 2 steam-powered sawmills that cut lumber into boards to build furniture. Now, this fort provided winter quarters for many, many travelers that were going into the Montana Territory to the goldfields, because they would leave and come west, and they would reach Fort Phil Kearny at the outbreak of winter, and most of them would spend the winter there. Without that, how well do they do? How do they survive? Not well. Okay? Now, outside the fort, on top of a ridge overlooking the fort, was a spot they referred to as Pilot's Knob. And basically it was just the top of a hill outside the fort. Pilot's Knob. So, on top of a ridge overlooking Fort Phil Kearny was a spot referred to as Pilot's Knob. And basically it was a lookout that provided a great view of approaching wagon trains, and more importantly the location of what? Hostile Indian warriors. So that Pilot's Knob was very important, and it was on top of a ridge just outside Fort Phil Kearny, which was used a ton by the military to see approaching wagon trains, or more importantly the location of hostile warriors. Now, there were 2 types of people lived in Fort Phil Kearny. There were soldiers and they were officers, and they lived a totally different lifestyle. Food and conditions for the soldiers were very poor, while officers lived a much better, more satisfying lifestyle. So there was a huge separation between the lifestyle of soldiers and officers at Fort Phil Kearny. Here was typical eating for enlisted men. This is what they got to eat at Fort Phil Kearny. Hardtack. You know what hardtack is?
It's like a little crackers.
It looks like a big saltine cracker about this thick that was made out of dough, and it was just hard as a rock. But they ate a lot of those when Civil War. Okay, hardtack.
Did they dunk them in their coffee?
Yeah, they would. They dumped them in their coffee. They were filling, but they were hard. It's like a big hard cracker. They also had coffee, pretty plentiful coffee, a little bit of brown sugar to throw in their coffee, but they spent a lot of time eating lard and salt pork. And a lot of this salt pork was left over from the Civil War, so it was almost 10 years old. So living conditions for soldiers weren't that great. Typical eating for enlisted men was hardtack, coffee, some brown sugar, some lard, and salt pork, which was left over from the Civil War, which frankly was old. Okay? So what did they lack in their system? Important, because you can get scurvy from it.
Yeah, vitamin C.
Vitamin C. So the soldiers had a serious lack of vitamin C, which caused scurvy. And you can die from that. Several soldiers did. Okay? So the soldiers had a serious lack of vitamin C, which caused scurvy, and many died as a result. A huge treat for the soldiers came from a black lady who was in the fort as a civilian who baked pies, and they sold them for $1. She sold them $1 a piece to the soldiers, and they used a lot of their wages, which what are they going to do with their wages? Just keep it. So a lot of soldiers spent money on the black lady's baked pies. Now, Colonel Carrington, I thought this was being a little bit tough. When he found out that the black lady was using military flour to bake the pies and sell them for her profit, what did he do?
Kick her out.
Cut the pies off. Didn't kick her out, but cut the pies off. So that they actually lost the one thing they really didn't like. Now think about this. I want you to think about this, see how smart we are. Why is this bizarre that they lived and ate that kind of stuff? Think about where they're located.
No,
There's a
no.
lot of game and stuff.
There was abundance of game around the fort. So why in the world didn't they go out and take care of some of the game?
With that.
Scared they can attack.
Because hunting was banned by Colonel Carrington because of the great dangers of hunting outside the fort. He didn't want his soldiers killed. So they had all kinds of game outside the fort and they weren't allowed to go out and hunt because he was afraid they wouldn't come back.
Familiar with harpoon guns that are on top.
An enlisted man made $13 a month. And they lived in barracks with a dirt floor and one stove. And there was an average of 60 soldiers in a barrack. So an enlisted man was paid $13 a month. They lived in a barrack with a dirt floor and one stove. And about 60 soldiers were in a barrack. Now don't take this the wrong way because I know you're young kids and I know the first thing you're going to think. It got so cold in the winter that the men actually slept together to keep warm. It was that cold. They had one stove in a barrack of 60 men, and the men actually slept together to keep warm. How about officers' wives? They stayed at the fort, and the officers stayed in nice homes with the best meals available at Fort Phil Kearny.
How much did they make?
Carrington's home was 48 feet by 22 feet with a 22 by 13 kitchen attached. So Carrington had a nice home there. It was 48 feet by 22 feet. And it also attached to that had a 22 foot by 13 foot kitchen. So he had a nice home for the conditions. Not like you living in paradise, but for the conditions. He had a home that was 48 feet by 22 feet. And it had a 22 foot by 13 foot kitchen attached. And who lived in that home? Carrington and his wife, Margaret, and their two sons, Jimmy and Harry, and their butler, George. So in the Carrington home, which was 48 feet by 22 feet, with a 22 foot by 13 foot kitchen attached, were Carrington, his wife Margaret, their two sons, Jimmy and Harry, and their butler, George. Okay, that'll take us to our last subtopic of the day, a short one. The Indian issue at Fort Phil Kearny. The Indian issue at Fort Phil Kearny. Now, I'm going to help Caleb understand what he said. He had a good point. Why didn't they just come and burn the fort down? Well, the surrounding Indians around Fort Phil Kearny would not attack a fortified military fort. Okay, they just wouldn't. Native Americans normally didn't go on the offensive. They would more often run the defensive. So they weren't going to attack that fort because it's a fortified fort, and if they attack a fort, they're going to get shot up and killed. I mean, there's no question about it.
Then you just send one guy in and you just start firing.
I'm going to have to put you in charge of the Native American attack scheme. So let's attack the fort, all four sides, and let them have them shoot them all right off their horses, because that's what they would have done. Okay? So they wouldn't do it. So what's the only way they're going to kill these soldiers and get rid of the fort? What?
To attack them
Oh,
when they're
cutting
out.
off the supply.
No?
Oh.
Well, they tried that. That's a good point. They
Attack them when
tried.
they're out of the fort, like.
Yeah, lure them out of the fort. If they lure them out of the fort into a valley, they could have a chance of getting rid of them. Now, there was a ridge. Kind of picture this in your mind. In Fort Phil Kearny, you got Pilot's Knob. Then there's a ridge that drops into a deep valley. And that ridge was called Lodge Trail Ridge. And the idea the Indians had in their mind was to try to bait the soldiers to come over Lodge Trail Ridge and get them into that valley where they could have a chance at it, because they weren't going to attack the fort. Now, that would not be an easy thing to do, but when did the soldiers most often go out of the fort?
To get supplies.
To provide relief when they were doing what? Cutting wood. They're still going to have to cut wood, as somebody mentioned, after the fort's built, to build, for their stoves and fires. Okay? They're still going to go out and shoot game for who? For the officers. And so, anyway, the Indians would try now. The only way they had to get them out in the open was to bait them over Lodge Trail Ridge. Okay? Well, on December 21st, 1866, on December 21st, 1866, the Indians would actually be successful in baiting the 18th Army Regiment out of the fort and into the valley, and this result would become known in Western U.S. history as the Fetterman Massacre. It actually was on December 21st, 1866. Soldiers from Fort Phil Kearny are going to be baited over Lodge Trail Ridge into the valley, and this event is going to go down in Western U.S. history as the Fetterman Massacre. We're going to talk about it tomorrow. Okay, what we got left is about a day of lecture. Then we're going to have a little review on Wednesday and probably a quiz on Thursday. Okay, everybody going to be here Thursday? Okay, that's the plan. Okay, that's the plan. What do you guys reckon?
We have a game in Buffalo. So we